Welcome to the world. To anybody who might have been anticipating a scheduled start time to this conversation, I apologize for the pretty dramatic technical difficulties that we've just wrestled through. I am pleasantly surprised that we resolved them at all, but really, really looking forward to this conversation that is unfortunately becoming more timely with every passing hour, it seems like. And so I'm joined by Carolyn Shapiro, who is a friend and a constitutional law scholar and professor, and the former Illinois Solicitor General, and really has been helpful to me, just even giving reading material around thinking through the moment that we're in. And so, just to set up the conversation, as folks surely know, we are right now in a waiting period where the Trump administration has repeatedly, and I think very credibly, threatened to deploy a variety of different types of military entities to participate in law enforcement here in Illinois. And I'm just going to start by kind of sharing my understanding at a very non-attorney level of what seems to be the plan, and then I'll just sort of hand it over to you, Carolyn, to share more specifics and details. And I do have a million questions, as I think most people probably do. But um, there's obviously been threat of utilization of National Guard from a variety of other states. And the threat, I think, is vague, and they're sort of blustering about public safety and law enforcement and disorder and crime. But if I'm understanding things properly, what seems to be the plan of action here is that they would step up the already outrageous immigration enforcement, that there would be kind of aggressive and I would say performatively provocative immigration enforcements in an effort to provoke some kind of reaction that they could then use as a justification to send in the National Guard, allegedly to support the ICE agents in carrying out their duty. And so I guess my first question, before I get into specifics, is kind of what did I get wrong, and what is your understanding of what the threat appears to be at this time?
Well, I think you didn't get much wrong. A- as we were trying to figure out why we couldn't connect on Substack, which eventually we did, I was actually watching Governor Pritzker live, talking about his information. So it's good. I'm totally up to date that I might not have been if we'd actually started on time. So I'm going to say what he had to say, but it is entirely consistent with what you said and my understanding. He said that he has heard from ICE that there is a plan to flood Chicago with immigration officers, and that they may well be deliberately targeting things like Mexican Independence Day community picnics and parades and other community gatherings, and that if what we've seen in other cities is happens here, what we will see are men. It seems like only men that I've observed in what a kind of generic police getup, and with their faces covered and without showing any proof that they are who they say they are. I mean, I think is extraordinarily dangerous. Leaving aside whatever anybody thinks about immigration enforcement, what it creates is an incredibly dangerous situation where bad actors can masquerade as these ICE officials. You can get the gear that they appear to be wearing online. So we'll see these masked men show up and seize people, and the circumstances under which they're choosing to arrest the people they arrest are extremely, or how they're making those decisions is extremely unclear. And they have certainly, in some places, detained American citizens. They've refused to accept identification proving that people are American citizens. They've detained people who are here who are not citizens but are here entirely lawfully. And people and then, of course, they've essentially disappeared lots of people who may not be here lawfully or may have a minor thing on their record from a million years ago, but who are productive, valued members of the communities, are doing work that is important in our communities, and are paying taxes, et cetera. And it's terrifying, right? Some of these people have American citizen children. They may have American citizen spouses. It's a very terrifying thing that we're seeing. And we just don't know who they're going to be seizing. So what happened in Los Angeles when this began, um, is that there were some pretty significant protests, and as part of those protests, there were some incidents of vandalism or of federal property and or things being thrown at um, the uh, pur- the ICE agents or the purported ICE agents, and I think it's also Customs and Border Patrol as well. And that then the president issued an order saying that he was calling out the National Guard. Now, he didn't limit this to California, but what he said was,
Mm.
in general, um, I we're not able to execute federal law due to this these protests and violence. And so, therefore, I'm going to rely on one of the provisions of the US Code that gives me the power under those circumstances to federalize the California National Guard. So that's what he, so to federalize the National Guard in general and to send troops into, to send other troops in as necessary in general. Um, and then the Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, specifically federalized the California National Guard and sent them to Los Angeles. So that's the playbook we've seen so far. It doesn't entirely match what the president's rhetoric has been. I mean, his rhetoric is all about how crime-ridden Chicago is, and that he's sending, just like he said about DC, and DC does have is different because it's not a state. Um, so just what's happened in DC is more legally justifiable, I think, than using the National Guard in Illinois simply for the purpose of combating crime. And I can talk a little bit about why that is, but
Yeah.
it's really important to point to this rhetoric the president keeps saying, and he said it again today, that there's all this crime. It's terrible crime. Of course, as Governor Pritzker and Mayor Johnson have been pointing out, crime in Chicago is actually significantly down. That doesn't mean it's not a problem. It doesn't mean that, we shouldn't be addressing it, but it's not like in this out of control new state that the president is.
Yeah. Well, right, but also what they're doing is not gonna do anything about crime. So that
What they're doing
that
is, I'm sorry, I missed the
what
last.
it's what they're doing is not gonna address the crime issue in any way, right? Which is to me the more telling thing than the crime data. They're not helping, so crime
Yeah,
could be
I
up
mean,
or down, and it
I think that they've been making claims about crime having gone down in DC since they deployed
right.
the National Guard there. I actually don't know if that's true or not. I don't assume it's true, but even if it's true, um, it could, an extremely plausible uh, factor is that people don't want to leave their houses to go out onto,
Yeah,
their militarized streets. So
of
that's, I guess,
course.
one way of reducing crime, like scare everybody into staying in their houses. Um,
Of course.
but yeah, but no, nothing that they're talking about in any way is calculated to actually address crime. And the National Guard, just to be really clear, the National Guard is not trained to address crime. They're
Yeah,
trained to
exactly.
do other things. They are trained to, they sometimes act as our military reserves, and a lot of National Guard members were deployed to Afghanistan and Iraq, and we depend on them to help in public safety emergencies. I remember at the very beginning of COVID, the place that we could get tested was somewhere, I think, in Harwood Heights, that was staffed by all these Illinois Army National Guard. And, I was incredibly grateful to them for the work that they were doing. but they're not trained to address crime. They don't have any of the training that
Right, it's made up. It's just
it's
made up, right? I mean, the thing that they're and this is where explaining, I think, the the reality in the streets doesn't match their rhetoric is important. The thing that they're hypothesizing is a level of mayhem on the streets that the only solution is to militarize our streets, is to invoke
Mhm.
a form of martial law, essentially. And that is patently just not going on, right? But I guess it I would love for you to say, I mean, you use this phrase. I'm going to sort of say a million things here that are going to have embedded within them many questions.
I may have to
Would you,
take notes then, but keep going.
um, I mean, I think you're probably giving me too much credit, but we'll see. Um, you use this phrase, which is obviously a technical term of federalizing the National
Mhm.
Guard. First, Trump's rhetoric about generically kind of federalizing the National Guard, and then Hegseth's specific order to federalize the California National Guard. I mean, the National Guard is a slightly funny thing, right? It's this military entity that's under the command of the governors, but is a part of the federal military and can be federalized under certain circumstances, and then has a kind of a variety of functions that they're made for, and then a variety of other functions that, under certain emergencies, they can be called upon to carry out. Um, they are, of course, not a police force. There's a difference between a military and a police entity. Um, and then on top of it, today there was a court ruling relative to the uh, federalization of the National Guard in California, pursuant to a late 19th century law, which I guess is called the Posse Comitatus Act, perhaps something like
Correct.
this.
Yes.
Um, and so I have like, so there's the basic question of like, hey man, what is this? How do these interlocking levels of authority and command function? How are they supposed to function? Um, And then I guess I can't help but think about this historically because when Donald Trump is overruling the wishes of the elected governors and mayors of these communities and fabricating a public safety emergency and generating this kind of militarization of the streets, like it's not hard for me to figure out what side I'm on. And then I think about the Little Rock Nine,
Mhm.
which is the instance of the National Guard being federalized that I grew up studying in elementary school even.
Mhm.
And that was a case where the Supreme Court ordered the desegregation of schools and the governor refused to comply. And so the president federalized the National Guard to effectuate the Supreme Court's order. And it is both the case that I don't have any trouble figuring out what side my sympathy is on in that instance, and of course, it's the case that it doesn't seem to me as like a non-lawyer, like a gray area, because the Supreme Court made a specific ruling and the National Guard is being deployed by the president to effectuate that ruling. And yet, it
Mhm.
sounds like this is an area of, it sounds like this is a subject where if it happened all the time, there would be a million gray areas. And probably when we're talking about gray areas about who's in charge of guys with guns, that seems like a really, really risky, dangerous, high stakes subject for us to study. So I guess, I mean, I'm going to maybe like awkwardly slap a question mark at the end of this paragraph and just ask for your help in both the technicalities of who's in charge when, what determines who's in charge, what triggers an appropriate federalization of the National Guard. And then if you'd be willing to editorialize for a minute, this sounds scary, and it sounds like the kind of thing that I grew up not being scared of because it just basically didn't happen almost ever. Um, what's missing in the law to protect us from dangerous militarization of these entities? Um, I think a lot about the fact that the founders of the country, whatever they got wrong, they were freaked out about too much centralized power. They were freaked out about uh, police states and militarization of government and authoritarians and monarchs. But, like the thing that was most in their minds was inappropriate quartering of soldiers. They wrote that into the Constitution. are there protections that are missing, or things that we need to be working on protecting ourselves from, given the modern world that we live in?
Okay, well, I don't think I can answer every single question that you posed in that paragraph with the question mark at the end. So I'm going to back up and try to talk kind of generally, and then you can ask me a bunch of follow up questions. But I'll start by saying you're correct. The founders were really worried about the militarization of police power. That's in part, what the British soldiers were doing in the colonies. And they didn't like it. And it's, in fact, not limited to the Third Amendment, right? The Third Amendment is the amendment that says um, soldiers can't be quartered in your home against your will um, in peacetime. That you can see pretty clearly why what the connection to the revolution there was. But also some of the more traditional things we think of as criminal procedure protections, like the right not to self-incriminate yourself, the freedom from, if that's in the Fifth Amendment, freedom from unreasonable searches and seizures in the Fourth Amendment, et cetera. Those also arose from their concerns about things um, that the British soldiers were doing. So this has always been a concern, and there's always been a desire to separate policing, ordinary policing, from the military. We actually talk about the police power as the thing that states have, and it means more than just policing, but what it means is sort of general law enforcement, general, and not just law enforcement, general regulatory power, and that the federal government has much more limited regulatory power. The states are the ones that are supposed to maintain the police power. Okay, so that's kind of like the background. And then in 1878, Congress passes this law called the Posse Comitatus Act. And Posse Comitatus means power of the country in Latin. I actually had to look it up. But it is when it traditionally was the kind of thing a sheriff would call together a bunch of people to help him maintain laws. In Westerns, you see the sheriff calls up a posse to go out and get the bad guys, or the anti-heroes sometimes. That's what they're talking about. And the Posse Comitatus says, essentially, and then there's a second law that supplements a little bit, but basically says it's a crime to use the military for this purpose. Um, and
Crime.
It's a crime. Yes. It doesn't, it also says, unless there is an exception in a statute, right? So
So,
then we
so
have,
sorry to interrupt. But who's the criminal?
well, that's a good question, right? It could be theoretically the president, although we know
Sounds
that the
like it.
president is immune from prosecution. But it could be anybody else who participates in that use. And
Hmm.
military officials they are not allowed to follow illegal orders. So there's a whole really um, fascinating and uncharted set of questions about when exactly is an order illegal. Obviously, we don't, as a general matter, want the military running around and saying, "Well, I don't know, I better do some legal research before I follow this order," right? Uh, but if it's blatantly illegal, they're not supposed to follow it. Um, so, uh, so that's posse comitatus, and posse comitatus says unless there's an exception. So then there are these exceptions. The one that's most famous and that people talk about is the Insurrection Act, which allows the president to suppress rebellion. For example, in particular, when asked by a state, which is obviously not happening right now, allows the president to use the military to suppress uh, any insurrection or domestic violence, et cetera, that so hinders I'm reading a quote, so hinders the execution of laws such that state residents can't exercise their constitutional rights. And that's the provision under which President Kennedy and President Eisenhower sent troops to the South, where the Supreme Court had said, these African American kids have the constitutional right to go to these schools. Um, the people, white people, were violently resisting. The state law enforcement was not uh, protecting the black kids. That provision was used then. And then there's some very, very general language that nobody really knows what it means, and if taken literally means that posse comitatus, which came later actually, couldn't even, it doesn't do anything. So that's not really plausible. But in general, the Insurrection Act applies to the idea of insurrection and the impossibility to execute the law under certain circumstances. There will, but the president didn't invoke the Insurrection Act when that's not what he said he was relying on to send the troops to California. Instead, he said he was relying on a law that has to do with um, uh, that has to do with the National Guard troops, and specifically allows the president to call up the National Guard, federalize the National Guard, if under invasion, rebellion, whatever. But relevant here, if he's unable with regular forces to execute the law of the United States. So what he claimed is, well, we have this problem that we can't execute the immigration laws because of these protesters in Los Angeles, and so, or that was right. That's how they chose Los Angeles. We can't execute the immigration laws, and so we're going to send the National Guard. By federalizing the National Guard, they take the National Guard from being, as you said, what is essentially a state militia. That's where they come from originally, the state militias that are commanded by the governor of each state. So, but when they're federalized, they become part of the national military, and they become under presidential command, and they become subject to the Posse Comitatus Act. So there were two things that have. So I'm just going to stop there. I have more to
Yeah.
say about what's going on in California and the court cases and all that, but I'm just going to stop and see if you have any follow-ups because I
Cool.
just said a whole mouthful.
So that I have a million follow-ups, and I do want us to sort of round the corner and talk as kind of concretely as possible for folks who are sitting in Illinois right now and wondering both what's coming, but also what we can do. But before we get there, I actually would like you, if you don't mind, just to um, share a description of the court case that was rendered just this morning, both what it said and also maybe even practically speaking, whether one would expect appeal and where that might
Yeah.
go.
Okay. So in order to talk about the case this morning, I do have to just give a little background. Um, and when the National Guard first arrived, as I said, this was the provision that the president and Secretary Hegseth relied on, is this provision that says they're unable to execute uh, the laws of the United States with their regular forces. And the judge, it appeared in front of him, said he didn't think that was true, essentially. And they went to the Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit, which is the federal appellate court that includes California. And the Ninth Circuit said, no, we really have to be very, very deferential to the president. And also, it looked at a very, very old Supreme Court case. And it said basically, as long as there's a plausible factual basis for this claim and the president appears to be acting in good faith, we're going to say that we're not going to delve any further into whether these particular conditions are met. So that litigation is going to be ongoing, but that's this current state of play. But the same judge today issued an opinion where he said, well, that's fine. Although he explained in detail why he thought it was not a good reading of the law. But he has to follow it. He's following it. But he said, but the question then is, can they engage in law enforcement as the Posse Comitatus Act says they can't? Yes, maybe they can be federalized under this provision, as the Ninth Circuit seems to think. But can they engage in law enforcement? So, first of all, are they engaging in law enforcement? And if so, is that permissible? And what he concluded was that they have been engaging in law enforcement, that it's not permissible. And he issued an injunction that says they can do things like guard federal buildings, they can guard ICE agents, but they can't themselves participate in the law enforcement. So they can't arrest people, and they can't do the raid themselves, that kind of thing. So he stayed his opinion for I think a week, And what will happen immediately is that the Trump administration will go back to the Ninth Circuit and ask the Ninth Circuit to stay this that injunction. And we don't know yet what will happen. And if the Ninth Circuit says no, the Trump administration will go to the Supreme Court and ask them the same thing. So I would not be surprised if this injunction never goes into effect, but I can't say for sure.
Got it. Well, so one thing that you said in your previous answer really I thought was clarifying and pretty scary. I'm just going to be clear. I'm speaking now mostly as someone who's thinking about organizing and change making, not somebody who's an expert by any means in the law. So here we are in this really scary moment. And the question is, what can we do? And it's clear that the plan is to try to provoke us into some kind of behavior that could be characterized as violence or a riot or chaos, and therefore justify federalizing of the National Guard. So what I would say then is like we all need to be in the street. We all need to be protesting. We need to make our opposition very clear and very visible, and our support of attacked and targeted communities very clear and very visible. And then you also made this other point, though, which is that the um, the pretext for federalizing the National Guard isn't, riots or violence. It's just, hey, the protests are effective, and so we're having trouble enforcing our immigration law. That the protesters are in the streets, and that so it's harder for us for ICE to find people that they're looking for. Um, so do you anticipate that even if the protests are 100% nonviolent and peaceful, they will
I
just
don't,
use
I
yeah.
don't, I don't know. I don't, I mean, I think that if it's 100% nonviolent and or then there's no evidence at all that any immigration actions have been impeded by violence or by throwing things, like whether it's a sandwich or something else. Um, uh, then I don't really know what a court would say. Um, but I do want to say something about nonviolent protest. First of all, nonviolent protest is crucial, and this has got nothing to do with the National Guard in particular, right? Nonviolent protest is essential because it is um, that's what scholars of authoritarianism have found over and over again is the way out. It has to be sustained over a long period of time, has to be a lot of people, but it has to be nonviolent. And so, I just want to really, really emphasize that. I also want to just add one more thing, which is that um, the president doesn't necessarily have to federalize the Illinois National Guard. And this, I actually do find this a little particularly scary. I think Governor Pritzker said in his press conference today that he has reason to believe that the Texas National Guard is being uh, getting ready to deploy to Chicago, and maybe they may already even be at the Great Lakes Naval Base. I don't know. That was kind of unclear to me. Um, that can happen, and that can even happen without federalizing. If the governor of Texas agrees to sort of give uh, the president control of the National Guard, he can do that. And then the Posse Comitatus Act doesn't apply because they are not federal. Even though they'd be under federal command, they wouldn't be federal. They're still technically operating a state militia. So that's a potential. That's potentially very scary. It might mean that they could do more than what happened in California, where they were federalized. It's also, and Governor Pritzker talked about this, really pretty shocking to think about a state sending its National Guard as the state National Guard into another state against that state's wishes. I mean, without the federalizing, like the federalizing, um, there are all kinds of things that are problematic about these laws. And you asked me about that, and we can talk about that a little bit. But ways that they could be strengthened to protect against abuse. But one kind of basic way might be to say, a governor can't do that to another governor uh, without the governor of Illinois would have to say, yes, we need help. We're having massive flooding and our National Guard can't handle it all. Please send help. That would be reasonable. But we don't, but that's not the situation we have here. In fact, we have quite the opposite, where the governor is saying, we don't need your help.
Yeah, of course. I mean, it reads very uncomfortably close to an invasion of one state by another. I mean, I'm sorry,
Yeah.
that's what I
I mean, yeah,
understand that's not its legal structure, but it's Texas sending their militia
to Illinois.
into Illinois to engage in paramilitary activity against the wishes of Illinois. That's
Yes.
that's messed up. That's
It's pretty
messed
messed
up.
up. It's pretty
Um,
messed up. And I'll just to say one more thing, because I know I've gone into a lot of detail and I keep pulling myself back. There is a lot of detail. I do just want to recommend two sources to people
okay.
that might be useful. The Brennan Center, which is based at NYU, has some great explainers on their website about the use of the military domestically, including about posse comitatus and about the Insurrection Act, et cetera. So I recommend, if you're interested in a deeper dive, going there. Another thing I recommend, as I was also listening to today, as I was getting ready for this, there's a podcast called Amicus, which is hosted by a woman named Dahlia Lithwick, who's a legal reporter for Slate. And this week's episode is an interview with the person at the Brennan Center who's most expert in this stuff, and it's from a couple days ago. So they're not really talking about Illinois. Talking more about California, but they're talking more generally, and I found it extremely informative. So those are two sources I recommended folks who are listening.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you for that. Yeah, I really do want to go back just for a minute to the question of protest, because I think it's, I mean, you articulated just what the research shows.
Mm.
Um, I think there is a kind of a tendency maybe sometimes to wait for somebody else to save us, some legal structure or some kind of entity somewhere to swoop in because it just can't possibly be this bad. So like the magic thing will make it better. And that's just not how this is going to go. It's
Right.
going to need to come from the people. The solution can only come from us. And um, you know, I'm accustomed to people. There's like a school of motivational speech that says like you can't afford to be scared right now, and the truth is I don't know how you could not be scared right now, and I don't think that it is reasonable or fair to ask people to simply suppress their fear. I think the question is not, are you scared? The question is, how do you react to the fear that we inevitably feel? And I also want to be very transparent about the fact that not all of us come to the table with the same vulnerabilities. And I don't think it's fair to ask people who don't have documentation to take the same risks that people who are citizens take. But what I do think is critical is for there to be a mass movement
Mhm.
in the streets expressing resistance, expressing again solidarity with the people who are under attack, expressing support in any way we possibly can, and then expressing disapproval of this authoritarian assault on our people. And, you know, that's not to say that it's a riskless thing to do, is to say that it's a necessary thing to do. And the challenge, of course, is that if we pull back from that, if the streets are empty as the tanks roll in, metaphorically for now, that just allows the takeover to accelerate, and we're going to be in an even worse position in months or years. So I just think we absolutely have to do everything we can to register our uh, n- non acceptance of this conduct. And every single person who's in the street helps. The more, the better. Um, and we just have to support each other in what's going to be a really, really, really scary time.
Completely agree. I think it's entirely rational to be frightened. Actually, I think people who aren't scared aren't paying attention. And absolutely, the uh, the question is, then, so people have faced scary things in the past, and what have they done? And different people have different capacities and different vulnerabilities. And that's all. Everybody obviously has to make their own choices about how vulnerable they are and what they can do. But it is definitely not a time to wait for somebody else to come in. It's got to be us collectively. And it's not. I don't think it's just going to be the law. I mean, I'm a law professor, and I also litigate sometimes, and um, the this is the law has there has been some real meaningful, at a minimum, slowing down, and in some instances stopping some of the illegal things that the Trump administration is doing. And now I'm talking well beyond this particular context. And then, of course, as probably most of the people listening probably know, the Supreme Court has allowed a fair number of things to go forward anyway. Although the vast majority of the injunctions that have been imposed have not actually been appealed to the Supreme Court by the administration. Yeah. Anyway, um, so it's not that the law can't doesn't have a role to play, but it absolutely cannot by itself get us out of the situation we're in. And because the situation we're in is that we have an authoritarian government, an authoritarian leader. I don't think we're on the road. I think we are there. I mean, people argue about this. But if you ask yourself, is there something I would have been willing to do 6 months ago or 8 months ago, like go to a protest, that I'm more nervous about doing today because of what might happen? That's a sign of the situation we're in. Um, and the administration has not shown itself to have a great deal of respect for the constraints of the law when they can get away with it. Um, I'll just add one more thing along those lines, which is, I just to everybody watching, be really careful when you read about the executive orders that the president is issuing or what he says about them. A lot of times he says things, or the press releases say things that actually aren't. uh, The executive orders themselves are milder. um, that doesn't mean to ignore them. And also sometimes they say things that really are not plausible legally, and some of those have, as they've been implemented, have been stopped. So don't, when the press says the president is going to require every state to have to get rid of mail-in voting. I mean, he has levers he can pull. I mean, it's not like he's not going to try to do that. And it's not that he might not be able to use various types of coercive pressure to try to make that happen, but he has no constitutional or even functional ability to just wave a wand and no, now we have no more mail-in voting. So just uh, use a lot of sources.
Yeah. I mean, yes, thank you. And I thank you for that. Um, I just want to quickly go back to what you said before. I mean, to give one specific example, you know, I've run for office a number of times over the years. This is my first campaign ever where many people regularly ask me if I'm sure I want to do this given the threat of violence that it brings on myself and my family.
Mm.
That is a question that I field multiple times a week. Um, and um, and frankly, it's a question I take really seriously.
Course.
And this is the definition, right? If people are not willing to participate in the political process because of the threat to their safety, whether they are candidates or government workers or voters or activists or organizers, um, that is authoritarianism succeeding,
Hmm.
right? So yeah, I'm not a academic scholar of authoritarianism who can tell you exactly where, what the seven prong
I mean, when I
testing.
said I think we're there, that's there's a very wide spectrum of what that means, and it certainly doesn't
Right.
mean you can't get out of it. I just want to be clear.
Exa exactly. We absolutely can get out of it, and we will eventually. The question is how soon and before what damage is done, and that's on us. Um,
I'm glad that you are running for office, despite the fact that there are, again, it's rational to be afraid of threats of violence in this time. Um, and I think, when I've had moments when I've been nervous about or fearful about things that I've done, including I represent some folks who have sued the Trump administration. Um, and we were pretty early among the lawsuits that got filed. I remind myself of people from history who I admire, people like Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass, and people who saved folks during the Holocaust, and people who died without seeing the fruits of their labor, who were facing things that are much worse than what we face, frankly.
right.
Um,
Right.
and those are some of my heroes. There are more, and I am sure they were scared a lot. So it's not a question of not being scared.
That's right. That's right. And it is. I do think it's important to remind ourselves how how much worse things have been in the world,
Hmm.
and how much more. I'm married to someone who studies the Ceausescu regime and talks about the absolute control that they had, the surveillance and the uh, mechanisms of control that they deployed over millions of people. Um, and that was overthrown as well. And so I don't despair of the possibility of success at all. Again, to me, it's a question of how soon, how much damage is done beforehand, and what do we rebuild after?
Yes. Well, that's a very
Because
long conversation. We
yeah,
might have to do that another time, Daniel.
well, I'll look forward to that. Um, this has been really educational for me. I hope for others, and I want to anyone who's planning on watching this live at exactly 3:15 Central. I apologize for the delay, but I'm sure we had people on nonetheless, and we'll be sharing it afterwards. There's a lot of really helpful information here, Carolyn, and I think the melding of the frankly abstract and dry legal questions with a very practical question of what do we do now that this attack is coming, and an understanding of what undergirds it, and also what history tells us we have to do is incredibly empowering. And so I just want to say thank you very much. This is
Oh,
a
my
fascinating conversation.
pleasure. And I just say one. Can I say one last thing about protest?
Of
I think
course.
this is not my area of expertise, but I do go to protests. Uh, but what I read from people who are more expert in it, protests can be really effective when they're joyful. When I mean, that's one of the reasons like people make these funny signs that, but when people are singing and dancing, and I sort of wonder in my mind, at the back of my mind, like, if it's true that the Texas National Guard are here, presumably some of them have never been to Chicago before, and maybe they've been told all kinds of scary things about Chicago. I mean, and look outside, Chicago is beautiful, and also if DC is any guide, they're not going to be sent to the parts of Chicago where crime is actually more significant. They're going to be sent to parts of Chicago where they're going to be seen by lots of people, so we'll all be kind of scared. Um, and maybe to parts of Chicago where there are large numbers of immigrants. But in any event, like, you know, it's not a scary city. It's a great city. And I hope that, maybe they'll see that.
Yeah, I love that. And I do want to just underline the thing you said about protest being joyful. It's joyful, it's communal, it's fun, it's weird, it's creative. Um, you know,
And it's more effective than, as writ large.
yeah,
That's what the scholars say.
for, and scholarship is cool, but also it's intuitive because a protest movement that people want to join
Mhm.
will be more effective than one that people don't.
Yes,
And so be open, be loving, be inclusive, be fun, be funny, and be passionate about building a better world, which is a good passion to drive having a lot of fun.
absolutely. Well, thank you, Daniel.
Thanks. I really, really appreciate this. Thanks for your time.
You too. Bye.
Bye.